I did nothing heroic. I wrote a letter because I couldn't keep my mouth shut. That's all I did. I am not homeless. I am not being bombed in Gaza. I am not, I could have retired from the UN in a couple of years happily. I'm not losing anything. I'm taking some harassment, getting a few death threats, but that's life when you speak. But this year is the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is the cornerstone of human rights movements all around the world. But that year, 1948, was also the year of the Nakba in Palestine, the first wave of genocidal expulsion that took place in Palestine. And it was also the year that apartheid was adopted in South Africa. And that kind of historic irony said something to me. For one, it reminded me that in the case of South Africa, the UN, the international community, remained focused on human rights, humanitarian law, international law, decolonization, and freedom and equality, and all of those sorts of issues that are the founding principles of the organization, until apartheid fell in South Africa. In the case of Palestine, all of that was abandoned 30 years ago because of the Oslo process, and quite intentionally by many actors who were involved there. And in the process, the Palestinian people were very much abandoned to this thing that has dominated the political side of the UN, whereby they talk about a two-state solution, even though in the corridors of the UN, everybody knows a two-state solution is an impossibility. Number one, there's nothing left for a Palestinian state. And secondly, that it never took adequate account of the human rights of the Palestinian people, because those inside the Green Line in current day Israel would be permanently relegated to second-class citizens in that context, and would never have a right to have their return or their compensation or their rights realized. And yet the UN, in the political rooms of the UN, continue to talk about the two-state solution as if it's a thing, in order to avoid talking about the real problems on the ground, which are inequality, which are occupation, which are persecution, which are apartheid, and today, which include genocide.
On the 28th of October, Craig Mokhiber did something quite amazing. He wrote a pretty long letter to the High Commissioner of Human Rights, Volker Turk, in which he said, "This is going to be my last official communication to you." And then he said he was going to leave an institution, the United Nations, where he had worked for 31 years because of a textbook case of genocide in Gaza, conducted by the Israeli government, a member state of the United Nations. And what Craig said in that long and important letter, which we're going to talk about, he said that he was dismayed that countries who were member states of the UN were not living up to their treaty obligations. A 31-year career veteran of the United Nations resigning at a time like this is something quite startling. And his resignation has, of course, captured the imagination. Craig, welcome to People's Dispatch. It's a great pleasure to have you.
It's my pleasure. Thank you, Vijay.
So, why don't you tell us a little bit about why you decided to take this quite serious action of resigning from a place you worked for 31 years since 1992, including worked in Gaza. Why did you take this quite monumental and important action?
Almost 32 years, in fact. And I think, this conversation started in March after the atrocities that were happening in the West Bank, long before the current attacks on Gaza had begun. You will recall in late February, there was the pogrom in Hawara. There were a number of Israeli attacks on villages in the West Bank. And I had spoken out quite forcefully of this as a human rights lawyer, as a human rights official of the United Nations, including publicly. And at that time, there was a campaign quite normal by Israel lobby groups and some of these troll farms and others who are very focused on the UN in order to attack me, but also to try to create problems for me within the institution. That's normal. We're used to that. If you speak out on, I've worked on human rights in dozens of countries on all continents. I'm never attacked unless I'm speaking about Israeli violations. But what I sensed at that moment, including from some in the organization who tried to quiet me down, was that there had through the years grown a kind of trepidation, a kind of a kind of fear amongst some officials when it came to this particular situation that I thought was very much clouding a principled approach and a principled vision for the region. So I wrote a letter and I always said to myself in these 32 years that as long as I feel like I can do more good, I would stay inside. And if I felt that I couldn't, then I would leave. And I think I've been very lucky that I have not been held back, and I have been able to work in solidarity with people all around the globe on human rights questions. But this clearly represented a shift to me. And so I wrote to the High Commissioner for Human Rights as the senior most official in the organization, the political appointee responsible for human rights. And I communicated to him my worry about this trepidatious approach that had made its way into some of the senior parts of the organization. And I flagged at that moment my intention to leave in a few months. Well, of course, since then, the situation got much worse. And the October events in particular horrified me as somebody who has been to Palestine, who has worked in Palestine, who did my first missions there, human rights missions during the first Intifada that started in 87 and continued in 1988, who was posted there as the UN's first human rights advisor in the mid-1990s. And who'd done several missions before and since in the country. So I wrote a letter at that point expressing my very deep concerns at how the positioning of the organization in the last 30 years in particular had moved away from the principled norm-based approach with human rights and international law at its center, the anti-colonial roots of the organization, that had been all pushed aside in favor of a kind of vague political program that was understood in the way that it was communicated by powerful actors. And by powerful actors, I mean the states of the West, especially the United States and the United Kingdom, parts of Europe, but also powerful states like Israel as the occupying power in Palestine. And that had driven us far off track. You know, every major international, as an example, every major international human rights organization, Israeli human rights organizations, Palestinian human rights organizations, independent UN human rights mechanisms have long since identified that the system in Israel and Palestine represents the crime of apartheid. And yet, officially, the UN does not take this position. Just to give you one gulf. The great hesitancy to talk about genocide, even when you have explicit statements of genocidal intent by senior Israeli leaders, including the president, the prime minister, cabinet ministers, military leaders, and all of the acts codified in the Genocide Convention actually being perpetrated as a part of that agenda. And in general, since the Oslo process was launched, a tendency to move away from this norm-based, human rights-based, international law-based response to Palestine, and into one that was, again, deferential to power. And, you know, there's a great historical irony that hit me, which is this year is the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is the cornerstone of human rights movements all around the world. But that year, 1948, was also the year of the Nakba in Palestine, the first wave of genocidal expulsion that took place in Palestine. And it was also the year that apartheid was adopted in South Africa. And that kind of historic irony said something to me. For one, it reminded me that in the case of South Africa, the UN, the international community, remained focused on human rights, humanitarian law, international law, decolonization, and freedom and equality, and all of those sorts of issues that are the founding principles of the organization, until apartheid fell in South Africa. In the case of Palestine, all of that was abandoned 30 years ago because of the Oslo process, and quite intentionally by many actors who were involved there. And in the process, the Palestinian people were very much abandoned to this thing that has dominated the political side of the UN, whereby they talk about a two-state solution, even though in the corridors of the UN, everybody knows a two-state solution is an impossibility. Number one, there's nothing left for a Palestinian state. And secondly, that it never took adequate account of the human rights of the Palestinian people, because those inside the Green Line in current day Israel would be permanently relegated to second-class citizens in that context, and would never have a right to have their return or their compensation or their rights realized. And yet the UN, in the political rooms of the UN, continue to talk about the two-state solution as if it's a thing, in order to avoid talking about the real problems on the ground, which are inequality, which are occupation, which are persecution, which are apartheid, and today, which include genocide. The other smokescreen they use is the so-called quartet. This, at best moribund, but I think entirely fake institution of the United States, the European Union, the UN, and so on, which has not functioned for many, many years in any meaningful way, and was never a credible body in the first place because it was rooted in this false representation of the United States as a mediator, when in fact the US has always been a party to the conflict. The US, in the current case, for example, is not only meeting its international humanitarian law obligations under the Geneva Conventions to ensure respect. Remember the obligation not just to respect in your own conduct, but to ensure respect by other parties over whom you have influence, in this case, Israel. But it has gone much further, and it is actually arming and financing and providing intelligence support and providing diplomatic cover up to the use of the veto to prevent a ceasefire in order to facilitate the Israeli war crimes that are being perpetrated in Gaza. That tells you what the quartet could ever hope to be in real life. And yet people will still talk about that in official exchanges inside of the organization. So I tried to make the case in this letter that was ultimately leaked that we need to abandon this failed paradigm of the past, and we need to start looking at the basic idea, what we would insist on in any other situation on the globe, if it weren't for this case of Israeli exceptionalism, which is a democratic, secular state with equal rights for Christians, Muslims, Jews, and others, rooted in international law, rooted in human rights, under the rule of law, that we need to once and for all find a way to fight for the deployment of protection for civilians there, that we need a transitional justice process, as we always insist in other countries, to hold perpetrators accountable and find redress for victims, that we need to enforce the international law that's already been codified. For example, the right to return and compensation for Palestinians who've been purged from Palestine in successive waves of ethnic cleansing. And we need to start taking equality seriously. And so I sort of laid this all out in this letter to the High Commissioner, and along with a number of immediate calls that we need to be unequivocal in our call for a ceasefire, but that a ceasefire is not enough. We need to work for an end to the siege of Gaza that's been going on for so many years, which is a form of collective punishment that denies Palestinians the most basic human rights codified in the Universal Declaration. And by the way, strictly on the basis of their ethnicity. This is a race-based persecution in all of historic Palestine and in Israel, and we need to say so. We need to not ratify ethnic cleansing, as is a part of the plan in Gaza right now, and insist on anyone who is forced to leave having the right to return wherever they want to in the country. And we need to really put the logo of the United Nations on the banner of the anti-apartheid movement that is already gaining force all around the world, as we did for South Africa. We need to do the same thing in all of historic Palestine. We have to work for accountability, I said. If it can happen through the ICC, great. If the ICC is going to continue to drag its feet and show double standards as it has up until this point, we need to find other means to ensure accountability for perpetrators. Just laid out what I think are just common sense understandings of what needs to happen in order to, first of all, resolve this continuous cycle of violence, and secondly, ensure the human rights of the occupied, dispossessed, colonized, indigenous people of all of historic Palestine who have been effectively abandoned. And we would be there already if it weren't for this moment of distraction that came with Oslo. I worked under the Oslo process in Palestine. I was hired to go to Gaza by one of the principal architects, the Norwegian diplomat Taria Larson at the time. And, as somebody who was reading Edward Said back then and who was always skeptical, I had my own discontents of peace. I indicated to him at that time that I was not a believer in what this would lead to ultimately, or this is a political solution. But I had been there during the first Intifada. I had seen the daily brutality to which Palestinians were subjected by giggling Israeli soldiers using American weapons and speaking in American accents as they persecuted the indigenous people in the most horrific ways on a daily basis. And I thought, if this can provide some breathing space for people in Gaza and the West Bank and East Jerusalem, if it can bring in some humanitarian assistance, some development aid, some reconstruction, just some space for kids to live normally for a little while, well, it's worth it, But it became evident within the first couple of years of that process that this would not lead to a solution. What it actually did was it put up a smokescreen behind which continued occupation, settlement expansion, dispossession, persecution, and gross violations of human rights continued apace until we arrived at the point in which we find ourselves now, where I have said in the letter as well, in my view as a human rights lawyer, that all of the elements of genocide that have been identified in the UN Convention on Genocide are in fact manifest now in Palestine.
It's an extraordinary letter. And I want to come back to your letter with a detour. About 10 years ago, I met with Rima Khalaf, high official previously of the Jordanian government, and then the head of ESQA, the Economic and Social Commission of West Asia, the most senior institution of the United Nations in the Arab world. 10 years ago, Rima Khalaf's team oversaw the publication of a text called Arab Integration. Quite an extraordinary text, actually. In the middle of the text, which was wide-ranging, it was a response to the Arab Spring, asking deep questions about the culture, intellectual culture in the Arab world, the question of education, and so on. There was one section where Rima Khalaf said there are two states in this region that are ethno-nationalist states, which discriminate fundamentally against parts of their population. One, Saudi Arabia, and second, Israel. And she had close to the word apartheid inside the text. I mean, I remember well, the Israeli government complained to the Secretary General at the time, Ban Ki-moon, asking for her to be sacked. Eventually, 3 years later, when Rima Khalaf oversaw the publication of a text co-authored by Richard Falk, where again the word apartheid was used, she was sacked. And so I understand, and I really appreciate the 10 points in your letter, from legitimate action to clarity of vision, one state based on human rights, fighting apartheid, return and compensation, truth and justice, protection, disarmament, mediation, solidarity. I mean, these 10 points summarize quite brilliantly the path forward, not a vague political program, as you said, but a clear path forward based on international law. And yet, Craig, nothing is going to happen. And I feel that that's the reason why this clear political program you've articulated comes in a letter of resignation, not as a demand that, Volker Turk and others start talking at high levels about these 10 points. This is a moment of clarity for a lot of people around the world. And yet it looks like the door to this kind of program simply doesn't exist. Tell our viewers a little bit of your hopes and sentiment that something new can happen based on perhaps these 10 points. What silver lining is there at a time when Israeli tanks have encircled Gaza City?
Well, I have to say I have largely given up hope on official institutions, whether they are state institutions or the political side of international institutions. And here I want to be very clear. I'm not attacking the UN as an idea, and I'm not attacking the entire UN. I believe that my colleagues doing human rights work, humanitarian assistance, the more than 60 UNRWA colleagues who have been murdered in Gaza just in the last couple of weeks are absolutely heroic. They are doing what the charter says, what the human rights treaties say. They're implementing that reality because most of them believe in it in their core. They are people who fight for peace because they hate war. They fight for human rights. They hate inequality. They fight for development because they hate poverty. But they have been abandoned by the political side of the House. And this begins, of course, with the member states who wield most of the power in the United Nations, as we could see with the US veto over a ceasefire, a humanitarian ceasefire. That was too much to ask from the US representatives in the UN. One of the permanent members of the Security Council, one of the most powerful members of the organization, but it extends beyond them into the political parts of the organization, into those that deal with political affairs. And in particular, we're talking about these political appointees at the top who are not career peace, human rights, and development people. They are people who come from governments and are placed on top of these agencies and institutions. And now sometimes these people can be quite inspired and decent people. And I think Rima, who you mentioned, is one of those people who cared deeply about these issues and who paid a price for it ultimately. But quite often they are just politicians in the first sense. And they have abandoned the people on the ground who are doing the good work and who really believe in the cause. So I do believe that they are a bright light. I do feel there are currents within the organization of these people, the human rights people, the development people, the humanitarian people, pushing to get the ship of the UN heading back in the right direction. Now, this, as I said, is probably the most difficult case. Because the pressures are enormous. You know, the United States uses its diplomacy and its power to make sure that there is no accountability for Israeli violations. And, you know, we saw this so clearly during one of the investigations some years ago that was headed by Richard Goldstone into one of the previous mass atrocities that had taken place. And we saw through WikiLeaks that the US had mobilized its entire diplomatic mechanism in countries all across the globe in order to sabotage, to block implementations or even the investigation that was carried out as mandated by the Human Rights Council. And that's just par for the course. You've got powerful states, in this case, doing everything they can to block a law-based resolution of the situation on the ground. But that is to a lesser degree true elsewhere, but this is a very special case in that regard. And that pressure is brought to bear in very real ways on people working within the organization. And so there is an atmosphere of fear sometimes. And it's funny that the closer you get to the top of the organization, the more trepidation there seems to be. The people in the trenches are screaming, you know. But the closer you get to the top, the more you get these political compromises that end up being moral compromises, and in my view, breaches of the obligations of the UN under the Charter. The brightest thing I see, besides those people in the trenches, is from civil society all around the planet. We have seen in this most recent onslaught, people rising up. I mean, I'm in New York City, a couple of blocks from here. We saw Jewish Voices for Peace, and If Not Now, an absolutely heartwarming, inspiring demonstration taking over Grand Central Station with thousands of people, mostly Jewish protesters, demanding that these atrocities not be done in their name, rejecting Israel's claim that it represents them, demanding human rights for the Palestinians and an immediate ceasefire, and hundreds of them so committed that they allowed themselves to be arrested and hauled off by the New York City police in the process. This is very powerful. This strips away the Israeli propaganda hasbara claim that they are somehow defending Jewish people, when Jewish people of conscience are saying, no, you're not. It's not in our name. And it also strips away, you know, one of the most brutal tactics that they use in the UN, which is that if you dare to speak out against Israeli violations, you'll be smeared as an anti-Semite, as they have done to me in recent days. And you know, if you spend your whole life, I've been in the international human rights movement for more than 40 years. I spent my whole life fighting against bigotry of every kind. I know the tactic. I know it's nonsense, but it still cuts when somebody says it. You're afraid somebody's going to believe it somewhere, you know? And so I made the point also in the letter that we need to be stronger on this. We need to say that criticism of Israeli human rights violations is not anti-Semitic. Criticism of Saudi violations is not Islamophobic. Criticism of Modi's violations is not anti-Hindu. Criticism of Myanmar violations is not anti-Buddhist. And if if those things are unacceptable, that's the end of the entire cause of human rights. There's no accountability. If it only applies to Israel, well, that's a racist proposition that says only Palestinians don't deserve defense of their human rights. Either one of those, it seems to me, is untenable. And so we need to really fight back on this. But when you see so many, progressive Jewish voices standing up in Europe and in the United States, side by side with Muslim and Christian and others, human rights defenders, peace activists of every stripe, that's where the hope is. And that my hope across the board on issues that affect civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights, as well as the right to development, is in civil society. It's in movements of people. Now, we saw a mass movement to oppose the war in Iraq. It didn't stop the Bush administration from carrying out its criminal attacks on Iraq. But there's something very powerful there. I feel there is a shift that's happening. And I think anyone who has the resources, whether they're feet to walk or money to contribute or a voice to use, should be working in solidarity with those movements that cut across issues. And that's for everything. That's to demand the right to healthcare, the right to housing, the right to water and sanitation, the right to development, an end to police abuses, an end to the prison industrial complex, an end to any of these violations of what was promised to us 75 years ago in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And I really think that's, as you say, the silver lining. That's the light that should inspire us. And I said in my letter to the High Commissioner, I cited this, and I said, the road to moral clarity is clear. Follow these people. They are out there on the front lines. They are heroic. I mean, I did nothing heroic. I wrote a letter because I couldn't keep my mouth shut. That's all I did. I am not homeless. I am not being bombed in Gaza. I am not, I could have retired from the UN in a couple of years happily. I'm not losing anything. I'm taking some harassment, getting a few death threats, but that's life when you speak. But those people, I was moved almost to tears by the action that happened at Grand Central Station and the hundreds who allowed themselves to be hauled away to these nasty New York City jails because they didn't want to be used in this genocidal campaign in Gaza.
It's quite right what you just said. I mean, I would like to say, using your own words, you said that high officials sometimes make political compromises which become moral compromises. On the other side, sometimes when you do something which is morally clear, as resigning after 32 years of working in the United Nations system, that has a political clarity as well. Craig Mokhiber, thank you so much for joining us at People's Dispatch.
It's my great pleasure to be here. Thank you, Vijay.